And when asked, gee, how come a public agency of the United States government being requested by citizens, including a senator, would be in the position to say no, the Federal Reserve answered, because it's not, you loved it, it's not in the national interest to reveal this. And they refused. They refused for the rest of 2008, they refused for the rest of 2009, and they refused in 2010 until Bernie Sanders, in order to get force the Obama administration, in order to get the financial reform bill through, they needed Senator Sanders' help, and he agreed in exchange for a provision, a little known, little attended provision that required the Federal Reserve to reveal who they had lent money to in those heady days in late 2008 and early 2009. So last week, when this bill's provision took effect, the Federal Reserve released it. I assume some of you saw these, the news reports that came out about it. And indeed, it was very interesting that the Federal Reserve lent huge amounts of money. And some of the interesting things, just to get you excited, you can read in all the major financial press. The New York Times had a nice series of 2 or 3 articles toward the end of last week that gave many of the details, and I'm sure you can find them. Just go to the federalreserve.gov website, and it'll give you that. Here are some interesting things. First, some of the companies that liked to pretend that they were above the problem, they were so brilliantly managed, they didn't need government help. Best example, Goldman Sachs. How we discovered that Goldman Sachs was going in for tens of billions of dollars day after day after day. So their brilliant mastery of this situation, okay, none of that. Number one. Number two, even more interesting. Who was the largest receiver of the largesse of the Federal Reserve in those months? UBS. Interesting. A Swiss bank. And if you look at the list, you will discover something that may come as a surprise to you as a Brecht Forum audience. The biggest bankers in the United States and the most important monetary authority of the United States proved itself in this crisis to be a deeply committed internationalist entity. There was no helping American companies and thumbing the nose at foreigners. The foreigners lined up to get the money, and they got it. Biggest recipient, a Swiss bank. The international understanding of the Federal Reserve is revealed. They understood it's an interconnected capitalist system. It's in the American interest to support the foreigners because we're so tied in with them, it kind of really doesn't matter anymore. We have to. We're not interested in whether you're Swiss or French or whatever. If you're a big bank, you're so intertwined with us here in the United States that we have to save you because that's saving ourselves. What an interesting idea, that capitalists should understand that in the moment of crisis, capitalists of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but the whole game. And compare that to the awareness of masses of people, of leftist organizations, and of trade unions, who are way behind in understanding and in implementing the kind of interdependent support, mutual support, that is demonstrated in what the Federal Reserve did. And the third interesting thing about the revelations, at least interesting to me, was the companies that went for money, beyond the banks. Caterpillar Tractor, geez, a ton of money. Harley Davidson Motorcycle Company receives a ton of money. Kind of really interesting how and who got there. And that hasn't been explained, just exactly why those companies are listed there and why other companies like them aren't. But it is, yeah.
Just in terms of describing the role of the Federal Reserve, Could you just describe its legal mandate and how it functions both formally as well as politically?
25 words or less.
Yeah, I realize that.
The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. We just don't call it the central bank. England has the Bank of England, and France has the Bank of France, and so forth, but we don't call it the Bank of the United States. That's only because of a peculiar historical fact. We once had a Bank of the United States, way back at the time of President Andrew Jackson, and there was a huge scandal, which is usually what attends large banks, if you know anything about the history of banks, and that was abolished, the Bank of the United States. We didn't have one for a long time, but it was so chaotic was our monetary system in the 19th century that by the end of the 19th century there was a groundswell of feeling you have to do something about the out-of-control banking system of the United States. So starting in the 1890s, a period of massive popularism, populism it was called in this country, a rise of farmer movements and working class movements, very strong socialist component, working class component. It built to a crescendo in the first decade of the 20th century, and so we decided to reestablish a central bank that would control and limit the craziness, the irresponsible, speculative, destructive craziness of our banking system. And so we passed the Federal Reserve Act and established this bank, the Federal Reserve, in 1913, early in the 20th century. I want to remind you, if you look at a history of an American history book, and you read about the 19th century, you will read it's punctuated by the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 18... The word panic is a literal word, and that's what it meant. It was those experiences which happened every few weeks, one place or another in America, and sometimes across the whole country. And here's what the experience. You went to the corner bank in your community to withdraw the money you had deposited there. And the bank was closed. And you rapped on the door and said, I don't want a loan, I just want my money back. And a large person with a stick came out and hit you, backed you away from the door. And a large sheriff came and did other things to you to make you stop bothering the bank. The bank had done what it's supposed to do. It takes deposits, yours, mine, companies, and it lends that money. And it lent it imprudently. They lent it to thieves, crooks, incompetents, and just plain regular businessmen who made a mistake. The mistake was you couldn't pay it back. Well, if you couldn't pay the bank back, it couldn't give you your deposits, hence the door was closed. This happened all the time. All the time. And it happens sometimes with big banks. So whole states collapse because everybody lost their money suddenly. You may have heard of the story that you have the silly old grandmother who told you to take your money and put it in a mattress. That wasn't a silly old lady. That was a lady who understood the 19th century and understood it's better than a mattress because that's then not going to be a panic that's going to bother you. It's going to bother your neighbor who put the idiot who put the deposit in the bank. Okay? So the Federal Reserve was designed initially to be an agency of the government to, number one, monitor all banks one way or another. Make sure that they're not doing irresponsible things. Require them to hold in reserve and monitor them. Eventually, some of these functions were devolved to other agencies. So the Federal Reserve doesn't do all of these things now. We have a controller of the current. We have other parts of the government that monitor what banks do. But the basic idea of the Federal Reserve was to control what was going on in the banks, to monitor the banking system, to bring some order, to force them to have reserves. The other thing that the Federal Reserve was to do was what all central banks do, which is to control the money supply. This is really simple. The complexities are not important. It's a simple idea. Once upon a time, in all capitalist societies, including ours, banks themselves basically printed money. That produced chaos as banks used that, I know this is hard to believe, but in imprudent ways. Imprudent ways. So banks had to be constrained. So imprudent were the banks, so irresponsible, so destructive what they did with their power to print money, that the power to print money was taken away from the banks. And they never got it back. The only entity in this country allowed to print money, to create money, is the Federal Reserve. They make the decision. The Board of Governors, the country is divided into 12 districts, United States. There are 12 Federal Reserve districts. So we here are in the district, we have a Federal Reserve Bank of New York. For New England, those 6 states, it's in Boston, and so on. Okay? So each bank, reserve bank, has a governor who's elected by the local banks, and government entities nominate some of the people too. And each one has a governor, and each of the governors of the 12 banks sits on the Board of Governors in Washington. The head of the Board of Governors is Bernanke. Okay, so they're the one, they sit around, I want you to grasp this, they sit around and they have a conversation. And the conversation goes roughly like this. How much money is circulating of our nice good money? You know, dollars, $5 bills, $10 bills, they don't go through the detail. What's the total? Whatever. All right, step 2. Do you think, you 12 men and women, should there be more? Should there be less? They have a conversation, they make a decision. If there should be more, Mr. Bernanke adjourns the meeting, gets on the phone, calls the mint, and says the famous words, "Roll them." And then the presses begin to work, and they pump out more bills. If the 12 esteemed ladies and gentlemen decide there should be less money, they gather it in, they have ways of doing that, and then they burn it, except for a small quantity, which they cut into very small pieces and put in fish-shaped glass bottles, which you can buy at an amusement store. In other words, I'm trying to be humorous. In other words, the Federal Reserve either increases or decreases the quantity of money. That's their job.